The question was simple enough. It should have been easy to answer. But when Steve Harvey asked Sarah Mitchell what her biggest dream was, the words caught in her throat like stones she couldn't swallow. Standing at the Family Feud podium in her carefully chosen blue blazer, the same one she'd worn to every court hearing, every adoption finalization, every first day of school for children who weren't born to her, but had become hers anyway, Sarah found herself face to face with a truth she'd never spoken aloud. "A real family," she whispered, and the words hung in the studio air like a prayer that had been waiting 15 years to be said. It was Thursday afternoon, at the Family Feud studios in Atlanta, and the energy was exactly what you'd expect from America's favorite game show. The Mitchell family had driven 8 hours from Birmingham, Alabama, in a rented van that could barely contain their excitement. But calling them the Mitchell family required some explanation, because traditional definitions of family didn't quite capture what Sarah had created in her 2-story house on Maple Street. Sarah Mitchell, 45, had never given birth to a biological child. Not from lack of trying, not from lack of hoping, but because life had dealt her a different hand entirely. What she had done instead was open her heart and her home to children that the world had given up on. Foster children. Kids with histories written in scars and silences. Children who flinched at sudden movements and hoarded food in their backpacks. Teenagers who'd learned not to unpack their belongings because they'd be moving again soon anyway. For 15 years, Sarah had been a temporary safe harbor for children in crisis. 53 children had passed through her doors. Some stayed for weeks, others for months, a few for years. Each one had left fingerprints on her heart, but the nature of foster care meant that most had moved on, back to biological families, to relatives, to adoptive homes, or simply aged out of the system entirely. Today, accompanying Sarah to Family Feud, were 5 of those children who had stayed, not because the system had failed to find them permanent homes, but because Sarah's house had become their permanent home. Marcus, 16, who'd come to her at age 8, after being removed from a home where neglect was just the beginning of his story. Twin sisters Luna and Maya, 14, who'd been separated from their siblings when they entered care and had clung to each other like lifelines ever since. David, 12, born with cerebral palsy, whose previous foster families had found his medical needs too challenging. And Emma, 8, the newest addition, who still sometimes woke up in the middle of the night, asking if she had to pack her suitcase. The game had progressed normally through the first rounds. Sarah's unconventional family had held their own against the Rodriguez family from Phoenix, their teamwork evident in the way they supported each other through every question. Steve had been charmed by their dynamic during introductions, particularly impressed by how the older kids naturally looked out for the younger ones, how they celebrated each other's successes with genuine joy. "Now Sarah," Steve had said during the opening segment, "I understand you've got quite a story here. Tell me about your family." Sarah had smiled with the kind of warmth that had convinced dozens of social workers over the years that her home was exactly where damaged children needed to be. "Well, Steve, my family is a little different. These are my foster children, but really, they're just my kids." "Foster children," Steve had repeated, his admiration clear. "How many kids have you fostered over the years?" 53, Sarah had answered matter-of-factly, as if that number didn't represent 53 individual miracles. 53 times she'd chosen love over convenience. 53, Steve had exclaimed, his voice carrying the kind of respect reserved for everyday heroes. "That's not just opening your home, that's opening your heart." Now, in the final round, with the score tied and everything on the line, Steve was asking the question that would determine the winner. But what he'd inadvertently done was ask Sarah to confront the one thing she'd never allowed herself to want out loud. "Sarah," Steve said, his voice carrying the gravity of the moment, "for the win, I need you to tell me, what's your biggest dream?" The studio was quiet, except for the hum of cameras and the soft rustle of 300 people leaning forward in anticipation. This should have been straightforward. People dream of money, of success, of travel, of security. But Sarah stood frozen at that podium, her mind racing through 15 years of loving children, who weren't technically hers, of attending school plays and graduation ceremonies as just the foster mom, of watching kids she'd raised call other people mom and dad. Behind the scenes, something unprecedented was about to happen. But first, the moment had to break Sarah's heart. "A real family," Sarah whispered, her voice so quiet that the microphones barely picked it up. Then, louder, with tears starting to form. "A real family." The words hit the studio like a physical force. Steve's expression changed immediately. In the audience, her kids, Marcus, Luna, Maya, David, and Emma, looked confused and hurt. They were her family. Hadn't they proven that? Hadn't they shown her that blood doesn't make a family? Love does. But Sarah wasn't thinking about the technical definition of family. She was thinking about all the times she'd been introduced as just the foster mom. All the times well-meaning people had asked when she was going to have real children. All the times she'd signed forms as temporary guardian instead of mother. All the nights she'd loved children completely, while knowing that someone, somewhere, might decide she wasn't their real parent. Steve stepped closer to the podium, abandoning his usual position. He could see that this wasn't about winning a game anymore. This was about something deeper, something that went to the core of what family actually means. "Sarah," Steve said gently, "help me understand. You've got 5 beautiful children right there in the audience. What do you mean by a real family?" Sarah's composure cracked completely. "I love those children more than my own life," she said, her voice breaking. "But I'm not their real mom. I'm just the person who takes care of them until they find their real families. I've never been anyone's first choice. I've never been anyone's forever." The studio fell completely silent. Even the production crew had stopped moving. Steve Harvey, the man who'd built a career on quick wit and perfect timing, found himself in territory where humor had no place. Behind the scenes, Steve made a decision that would define this moment forever. What happened next has never been fully revealed, but those present that day describe it as one of the most extraordinary moments in television history. Steve looked at Sarah, then at her children in the audience, then back at Sarah. Without consulting producers, without following any protocol, he did something that no game show host had ever done. "Hold on," Steve announced to the studio. "Just, everybody hold on." He walked away from his podium, past Sarah, directly into the audience where Marcus, Luna, Maya, David, and Emma sat watching with confusion and hurt in their eyes. The cameras followed him, but what they captured wasn't planned television. It was spontaneous human connection. "Marcus," Steve said, addressing the 16-year-old who'd been with Sarah the longest, "stand up for me." Marcus stood, his teenage awkwardness evident, but his loyalty to Sarah absolute. "How long have you been with Sarah?" Steve asked. 8 years, Marcus replied, his voice steady despite the emotion of the moment. 8 years. "And in those 8 years, who's been there when you were sick?" "Sarah." "Who helped you with homework every night?" "Sarah." "Who taught you to drive?" "Sarah." "Who's been to every one of your basketball games?" "Sarah." Steve turned to the twins. "Luna, Maya, who braids your hair every morning?" "Sarah," they said in unison. "David, who learned sign language so she could communicate with you better?" David's answer was signed and spoken simultaneously. "Sarah." "Emma, who checks for monsters under your bed every single night?" "Sarah," Emma whispered, but her voice carried clearly through the studio's silence. Steve nodded, then did something that broke every rule of television production. He began walking back toward the stage, but he didn't stop at his podium. He walked directly to Sarah and took her hands in his. "Sarah," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I want you to listen to me very carefully. You just heard 5 children tell this entire studio who their real mother is. Not their foster mother. Not their temporary guardian. Their real mother. You." Sarah was crying openly now, but Steve wasn't finished. "You want to know what your biggest dream is?" Steve continued. "Your biggest dream isn't to have a real family. Your biggest dream already came true. You are a real family. You're just the only one who doesn't see it yet. But this is the moment no one in the studio, and no one watching at home ever saw coming. Steve reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his cell phone. The audience watched in confusion as he dialed a number right there on stage. "Steve Harvey here," he said into the phone, his voice carrying the authority of someone who was used to making things happen. "I need you to do something for me. I'm standing here with a woman named Sarah Mitchell from Birmingham, Alabama. She's got 5 foster children who need to become her legal children. Today, I don't care what it costs. I don't care what strings you have to pull. I don't care what paperwork you have to expedite. These kids need to go home tonight knowing they're never leaving." The studio audience began to understand what was happening. Steve Harvey was using his influence, his connections, his resources to do something unprecedented. He was facilitating adoptions live on television, but he still wasn't finished. Steve handed the phone to Sarah. "There's a family court judge on the line," he said. "She's waiting to hear from you." Sarah took the phone with trembling hands. The conversation that followed was brief, emotional, and life-changing. When she handed the phone back to Steve, she was crying too hard to speak, but her tears were different now. They weren't tears of longing anymore. They were tears of joy. Steve turned to address the studio audience. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "we just witnessed something that's never happened on this show before. Sarah Mitchell is about to become the legal mother of 5 incredible children. Not foster mother, not temporary guardian. Mother." The audience erupted. 300 people rose to their feet in an ovation that went on for minutes. But the most beautiful part wasn't the applause. It was watching Marcus, Luna, Maya, David, and Emma rush from the audience onto the stage to embrace the woman who had just officially become their mother. Steve watched the family reunion with tears streaming down his face. Then he did one more thing that no one expected. He took off his suit jacket, the same jacket he wore for every taping, his signature piece that had become part of his television persona, and draped it around Sarah's shoulders as she held her children. "This jacket has been with me through every show I've ever hosted," Steve said. "But today, it needs to go home with someone who understands what real family looks like. Because you didn't just answer the question, Sarah, you lived it." As the cameras finally stopped rolling and the audience began to file out, something beautiful continued to unfold. The Rodriguez family, who had technically lost the game, approached Sarah's family not with disappointment, but with congratulations. Other families who had been taping that day, crew members, even the production assistants came forward to share in this moment of joy. But perhaps the most meaningful response came from an unexpected source. As Sarah was gathering her things, preparing to leave with her newly official family, a young woman approached her. She was in her early 20s, professionally dressed, with tears in her eyes. "Mrs. Mitchell," she said tentatively, "my name is Jessica. I was one of your foster children about 10 years ago. I was only with you for 3 months, but..." Sarah's face lit up with recognition. "Jessica. Oh my goodness, look at you. I wanted you to know," Jessica continued. "I've been watching the show, and I need you to understand something. You were my real mom too. For those 3 months, you were the first person who ever made me feel like I was worth something. I'm in law school now because of the confidence you gave me. I'm studying family law because I want to help kids like us, like I was." Sarah hugged Jessica tightly, and Steve, who had been watching this reunion, felt his understanding of the day's impact grow even deeper. This wasn't just about 5 children finding their forever home. This was about the ripple effects of love, about how one person's decision to open their heart can change not just individual lives, but entire futures. 6 months later, the episode aired exactly as it happened, with no editing to remove Steve's unprecedented intervention. The response was unlike anything in game show history. Thousands of viewers reached out to share their own stories of foster care, adoption, and unconventional families. The episode sparked a national conversation about what makes a family real and highlighted the critical need for foster parents. Steve's foundation partnered with adoption agencies across the country to help expedite adoptions for children in care. The episode became a catalyst for legislative changes that streamlined the adoption process for foster families who had already demonstrated their commitment to children in their care. But the most important change was in the Mitchell household on Maple Street in Birmingham. Sarah still fosters children. She can't help herself, but now she does it as a legal mother to 5 children who know they're never leaving. Marcus graduated high school as valedictorian and is now studying social work, planning to help families like his own. The twins are honor students and volunteer at the local children's hospital. David's artwork, encouraged by Sarah's unwavering support, has been featured in galleries. Emma, once terrified of unpacking her suitcase, now helps new foster children feel welcome in their home. Sarah still has Steve's jacket. She wears it to every important occasion: graduation ceremonies, adoption court hearings for other foster children, and the annual gathering she hosts for all 53 children who have passed through her doors over the years. It's a reminder that family isn't defined by biology or law, but by love, commitment, and the choice to show up for each other every single day. Steve Harvey learned something that day that changed how he approaches every show, every contestant, every moment he spends in front of those cameras. He learned that sometimes the most powerful moments in television happen when you throw away the script and follow your heart, when you use your platform not just to entertain, but to change lives. The question that broke Sarah's heart, "What's your biggest dream?" became the question that fulfilled it. Because sometimes our biggest dreams aren't about getting something we don't have. Sometimes they're about recognizing the miracles we've already created, the love we've already built, the family we've already become. The foster mom's dream wasn't to have a real family. Her dream was to recognize that she already had one, and that love, not blood, is what makes a family real.